It all started on an ordinary day when I found myself walking through the busy streets of London. The sun was shining, the hustle and bustle of the city was in full swing, and I was just another face in the crowd. I had my sunglasses on, hoping to avoid too much attention. But as I walked past the familiar landmarks, something felt off. It was as if something was brewing in the air, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. Now, if you don't already know, I'm Big Shaq, yes, the one who's known for the Man's Not Hot track and all those viral moments that made me an international name. But here's the thing. There are moments in life when being a celebrity isn't always the blessing it's cracked up to be. Sometimes people don't recognize you, and sometimes, well, people think you're just a regular guy. That's exactly what happened to me that day. I was just casually strolling along when I noticed a group of people staring in my direction. I wasn't sure if it was because they recognized me or if I had something weird going on, like my shirt was tucked in weirdly or something. I didn't think much of it. People stare sometimes, right? But as I kept walking, I felt the eyes following me. A couple of people even whispered to each other. Normally I'd brush it off, but this time, something felt different. One of the guys from the group walked up to me, looking at me as if he was about to ask for an autograph or a selfie. I thought to myself, okay, here we go, another fan. Instead, he said, "Hey mate, you look just like Big Shaq. You sure you're not him?" I stared at him for a second, thinking maybe he was joking, but there was no smile on his face, no twinkle in his eye. He genuinely thought I was just some guy who looked like Big Shaq. I chuckled to myself, but I wasn't sure what to say. Should I tell him I was, in fact, Big Shaq? Or should I just let the situation play out? I wasn't in the mood for the usual celebrity fanfare, so I just shrugged and said, "Nah, mate, I get that a lot." I figured I'd avoid any awkwardness and just move along. But the guy wasn't having it. He squinted his eyes at me and continued to study my face, almost like he was inspecting me for clues. "Seriously though," he said, "you look just like him." "Are you sure you're not him? Like, you even sound like him." Now, this was getting interesting. Not only was I being mistaken for someone else, but it was my own self. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. "Nah, mate," I replied with a smile. "You're just seeing things." But he wasn't convinced. He kept insisting, looking at me like I was some kind of imposter. And that's when it hit me. He wasn't just some casual guy on the street. He was a true fan, someone who had followed my career and had a deep belief that I was, in fact, Big Shaq. And that realization made the situation even more bizarre. As we stood there, this guy started talking to me as if we were old friends, like we had met 100 times before. He was giving me advice on what I should do next in my career, asking about my music, and even offering to take a picture with me. It was so surreal that I almost felt like I was in some sort of parallel universe, where I wasn't the celebrity I was, but just a regular guy, getting mistaken for someone famous. And what made it even stranger was that other people were starting to notice. They had heard the conversation and were now slowly gathering around us. Some were trying to sneak a photo. Others were asking for a handshake, while a few were offering their own unsolicited thoughts on my career. At this point, I realized that the guy wasn't the only one who thought I was Big Shaq. I was now surrounded by a small crowd of people, all convinced that I was the famous rapper. I couldn't help but chuckle to myself. Here I was, A guy who had spent years in the limelight, now being treated like a regular person who happened to look like a famous celebrity. It felt so odd. On one hand, I had the opportunity to live my life without the constant barrage of fans and cameras. But on the other hand, it was almost like I was trapped in this strange moment where people expected something from me that I couldn't deliver. After a few minutes of chatting and laughing with the crowd, I decided to break the news to them. I smiled and said, "All right, guys, I've got to admit it. I am Big Shaq." The reaction was priceless. Their faces went from confusion to shock to complete disbelief. Some of them couldn't believe it, while others were immediately apologetic, trying to make up for the earlier misunderstanding. It was a hilarious turn of events that left everyone laughing. They couldn't believe they'd been talking to me all along without even realizing it. But here's the thing that really hit me: the power of perception. For those few minutes, I was just a guy walking around the city, not as Big Shaq, but as someone who could be mistaken for him. It was a reminder that despite being in the public eye, you're still just a regular person at the end of the day. And sometimes, that's the most refreshing feeling in the world. So, what did I take away from this strange encounter? It was a reminder that life has a funny way of throwing curveballs, and sometimes it's okay to just be a regular guy, even if you're Big Shaq. It was just another typical afternoon in London. The kind of day where you don't expect anything out of the ordinary to happen. The streets were crowded as usual, with people moving in every direction, lost in their own worlds. I was in one of those moods where I didn't feel like dealing with the usual hustle of life. I had no plans, no events to attend, just a few hours to kill. So, I decided to take a walk around the city, hoping to clear my head. As I strolled through the streets, I noticed the usual mix of sounds: the honking of cars, the chatter of pedestrians, and the occasional siren in the distance. I had my hood up and sunglasses on, trying to keep a low profile. But let's face it, it's hard to hide when you're someone as recognizable as Big Shaq. Still, I didn't think much of it. People had always been respectful about giving me space, especially in public places like this. But then, something strange happened. I felt eyes on me. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. You know, when you're deep in thought, it's easy to feel like you're being watched, even if you're not. But no, this was different. It was like someone was really paying attention, like their gaze was focused entirely on me. I tried to ignore it and kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I turned my head slightly to the side and saw a small group of people standing outside a cafe. They were looking at me, whispering to each other. I couldn't hear exactly what they were saying, but the looks they were giving me made me think they were trying to figure something out. I wondered if they recognized me, or if there was something about me that stood out in a way that was drawing attention. Then one of them, the boldest of the bunch, took a step toward me. I could feel the tension building in the air as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Was I about to get asked for an autograph or a selfie? Was this going to turn into one of those awkward celebrity encounters? I braced myself, figuring it was just another fan moment. But the next few words that came out of the guy's mouth caught me completely off guard. "Oi, mate," he called out. "You look just like Big Shaq. Are you sure you're not him?" For a split second, I stood there, frozen in place. My brain had to process what had just happened. I wasn't sure whether to laugh, to be offended, or to just walk away. I mean, Sure, I had heard it all before. People tell me I look like other celebrities sometimes. But this was different. This wasn't a fan asking for a picture. This was a person, seriously, wondering if I was in fact Big Shaq. I chuckled to myself, trying to brush off the weirdness of the situation. Nah, mate, I replied, keeping it light. I get that a lot. I figured that would end the conversation, that he'd either recognize the joke or just move on. But no. Instead of walking away, the guy took a step closer, squinting his eyes as though examining me more carefully. Seriously, though, he continued, you really do look like him. Are you sure you're not Big Shaq? You even sound like him. It was starting to get a little absurd, honestly. I mean, this was happening in real life, right? Here I was, just an ordinary guy walking down the street, and someone genuinely thought I was the rapper Big Shaq. I tried to keep my composure, but my mind was racing. I had to think quickly. What should I do? Should I tell him the truth? Or should I keep playing along and see where this weird conversation went? So I shrugged and gave him the best response I could muster. Nah, mate, trust me. You're seeing things. But this guy wasn't buying it. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing, and said, no, really. You look just like him. I've seen your videos, and I know your music. You can't fool me. At that moment, I realized that this wasn't just some casual guy who made a passing comment. This was someone who was genuinely convinced that I was Big Shaq. It wasn't a joke to him. And that realization left me feeling a little more bewildered. How did I get myself into this? How had I become so completely unrecognizable that people thought I was a totally different person? But it wasn't just the one guy who thought I was Big Shaq. As the conversation continued, more people gathered around us, drawn in by the apparent commotion. They heard the guy's questions and his insistence, and they started looking at me with the same confused expressions. Before I knew it, a small crowd had formed. Some of them were whispering, others were laughing, and a few were pulling out their phones, getting ready to take pictures or even video. I couldn't help but feel like I was in a bizarre situation. This was getting out of hand. What made it even stranger was that the crowd wasn't just standing there awkwardly. They were all engaging with me as if I was the real Big Shaq. People started commenting on my clothes, asking about my next track, and even offering up random suggestions on how I should improve my music. There was one guy who told me I should put out a Christmas album because he loved my Man's Not Hot track. And there was another woman who said I needed to do a collab with some other artist that she thought would be perfect for me. It was as if I had entered some alternate reality where I wasn't just walking down the street, but I was actually Big Shaq in a world where everyone knew me. But I didn't know them. I wasn't sure whether to be flattered or frustrated. I wasn't even sure if I should keep going with this ruse or just tell them the truth. But as the conversation went on, it became clear. These people were completely convinced. They had made up their minds that I was the man they saw on TV, and nothing was going to change that. Eventually, I decided to cut through the nonsense. I didn't want to keep up the act. So, with a big grin on my face, I said, "All right, guys, I'll admit it. I'm Big Shaq." The reactions were priceless. For a split second, there was silence. People's jaws dropped. And you could see the confusion in their eyes as they tried to process what I had just said. Then, like a wave crashing, the realization hit them. Some were laughing hysterically, while others were apologizing. embarrassed by the fact that they had been duped. A few were even speechless, their eyes wide, as if they couldn't believe they had been talking to the real Big Shaq the entire time. The entire experience was completely surreal. It was one of those moments where I couldn't help but laugh at how bizarre it all was. But it was also a reminder of something I had almost forgotten: the unpredictability of life. You never know what's going to happen next. One minute, you're just walking down the street, and the next, you're mistaken for someone else entirely, and the world around you shifts in a way you never imagined. This wasn't just a funny incident. It was a wake-up call, a reminder that life, fame, and recognition are all about perception. One moment, you're a stranger in a crowd, and the next, you're a celebrity in disguise. At first, I honestly didn't know how to react. I mean, here I was, caught up in this incredibly bizarre moment where people were actually treating me like I was Big Shaq, and it wasn't like they were just being polite or friendly. No, they were convinced I was him. The man they had seen on the screens, the rapper with the catchy tunes, the viral sensation who made everyone laugh with his distinctive humor and catchy beats. And let me tell you, I couldn't help but chuckle at the whole thing. At first it was funny, seeing people's eyes light up with recognition, talking to me like I was a long-lost friend they hadn't seen in years. The whole situation had a surreal quality to it. I wasn't used to being this center of attention. At least, not in the way they were giving it to me. It was like I had stepped into a world where I didn't belong, but was being treated as if I did. So I went with it. I played along for a little while, just to see how far this would go. There's something undeniably hilarious about pretending to be someone else, especially someone as popular as Big Shaq. I mean, the whole man's not hot persona, the crazy raps and the funny videos, it was all too perfect. People were treating me like I was a star, asking for selfies, complimenting my music, and chatting about things I had no idea about, but was willing to humor them for the fun of it. But deep down, something was starting to gnaw at me. The longer I stayed in the character of Big Shaq, the more uncomfortable I felt. This wasn't just some harmless fun anymore. It was beginning to feel like I was in over my head. I mean, sure, I could keep up the act. I could continue to smile and nod as if I had all the answers about upcoming albums and music collaborations. But was that really who I wanted to be in this moment? And then it hit me. The truth. I wasn't Big Shaq. I didn't have his fame, his voice, or his personality. I wasn't the guy who could drop a verse and make everyone laugh or rap a line that would get stuck in your head for days. I wasn't the guy who had a team of people working behind the scenes, pushing out music videos and attending interviews. I was just me. I realized that I didn't need to pretend to be someone else just to get some attention or validation. Sure, it was fun for a while, but I didn't want to be known as someone I wasn't. The laughter was fun, but at some point, I needed to step out of the character, step away from the spotlight, and show people the real me. So, I decided to tell them. I gathered my thoughts, took a deep breath, and said, "All right, folks, here's the deal. I know you all think I'm Big Shaq, and I've been playing along because honestly, I didn't know how to get out of this, but I'm not him. I'm just a guy walking down the street, and somehow, I ended up in this ridiculous situation." For a split second, the crowd went silent. The words hung in the air like a strange mist, and it seemed as if they didn't know how to process what I had just said. Their faces, which had been filled with excitement and admiration just moments ago, suddenly fell into confusion. Some of them looked at me, trying to read my expression, and others looked at each other, wondering if I was joking or if they had somehow misinterpreted the whole thing. But then, a few of them started laughing. I could hear someone in the back say, "Wait, so you're telling me you're not actually Big Shaq?" The realization dawned on them, and in an instant, the tension was broken. People started laughing, some even shaking their heads in disbelief, while a few of them apologized for the mix-up. It was one of those moments where everything became clearer, and I could finally see the humor in the whole situation. They had all been so caught up in their own excitement, so eager to believe that they had stumbled upon someone famous, that they hadn't stopped to think about the possibility that they could be wrong. But I wasn't angry at them. Honestly, I wasn't even annoyed. How could I be? The whole thing had been so unexpected, so surreal, that it was hard not to find it funny myself. In the end, I told them that I wasn't Big Shaq, but that I appreciated the fact that they thought I was. I told them I wasn't some big star, but just a regular guy who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. And honestly, after clearing the air, I felt relieved. The weight of pretending had lifted off my shoulders, and I could finally just be myself again. And yet, there was still this feeling of warmth that stayed with me. Even though I wasn't who they thought I was, they were kind to me. They didn't treat me differently after I told them the truth. They didn't walk away in disappointment or act like I wasn't worth talking to anymore. In fact, many of them thanked me for clearing things up, even told me I was still cool for handling the situation so well. As I turned to leave, one of them called out, "Hey man, you might not be Big Shaq, but you're still pretty chill." That made me smile. Maybe I didn't need to be anyone else. Maybe just being myself was enough. Walking away from that crowd, I couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. It was one of those absurd moments that in hindsight became a lesson in humility and authenticity. I realized that it wasn't about pretending to be someone else or about the fame and recognition that comes with it. What mattered most was how people treated you when they knew the truth, when they saw you for who you really were. In that moment, I learned that even when life throws you into a wild situation, it's important to be honest and stay true to yourself. But for now, I was happy to walk away from that encounter with a smile on my face, knowing I had shared a crazy story. A story where, for just a few moments, I got to see what it was like to be Big Shaq. But also, a story where I got to remind myself that being myself was more than enough. The reactions from the crowd after I cleared up the confusion were almost as interesting as the mix-up itself. At first, there was a moment of pure disbelief. I could see the shock written all over their faces, as if they were trying to wrap their minds around the fact that they had just been standing there, chatting with someone who wasn't the Big Shaq they had imagined. Some people looked like they were ready to ask me for an explanation, still unsure whether I was pulling their leg. Others, however, seemed to realize they had been duped and found the whole thing hilarious. The first reaction came from a couple standing at the edge of the crowd. One of them, a young woman with long blonde hair, let out a laugh that was half surprise, half amusement. She took a step back and looked at me, then said, "Wait, so you're telling me this whole time I've been talking to someone who's not Big Shaq?" Her eyes widened as she processed it, and before I could even respond, she burst out laughing. "Oh my God, this is too good. You really had me fooled." Her friend, a guy with glasses and a beanie, joined in, chuckling and shaking his head. Man, that was wild. I was starting to think I was about to get an autograph from Big Shaq himself. I mean, you totally had the look. I was almost convinced. I could hear some of the others laughing as well, and at that moment, I realized that the awkwardness that had initially filled the air had turned into something far more relaxed. The tension was gone, replaced by laughter and lightheartedness. It was a weird feeling, knowing that I had just been part of this strange social experiment. And yet, the way the crowd reacted made it clear that no one was really bothered by the mix-up. In fact, most of them were pretty amused by it. Then came the comments that started to pour in from all directions. Some people couldn't believe they had been so gullible, while others were just excited by the whole experience. One person, an older gentleman with a thick accent, approached me with a grin on his face. "Well, you know, I didn't think you looked exactly like Big Shaq, but I didn't want to be the one to ask," he said. "Now that you've told me, though, this is the funniest thing that's happened to me all day." A few others seemed genuinely interested in hearing more about the whole situation. They started asking questions, like how I ended up in the position where I was mistaken for a famous rapper. Some of them even said they'd seen me around before, but never realized who I was. Somehow, they'd missed the fact that I wasn't actually the Big Shaq they thought they had met. A few people even asked for a selfie, still unsure whether they should just take the chance or whether they were missing out on an actual celebrity encounter. One of the younger guys, a teenager with his phone in hand, started laughing so hard that he almost dropped it. "Yo, you're not Big Shaq? I thought I was about to hit you up for a collab or something." He wiped away a tear from his eye as he grinned, clearly enjoying the absurdity of the situation. "That's hilarious, man. You've got the whole vibe, though. You should totally start a YouTube channel or something and pretend to be him. You could go viral." At this point, I was laughing along with them, shaking my head in disbelief at how quickly things had turned into this ridiculous spectacle. Honestly, the laughter and good-natured teasing felt like the whole thing had been some kind of cosmic joke. Nobody was angry or upset that they'd been tricked. Instead, they were just rolling with it. There was something deeply human about the way everyone was reacting. They were laughing at themselves as much as they were at the situation. As I moved away from the group, trying to avoid being the center of attention for too long, I could hear bits and pieces of their conversations behind me. "Did you really think he was Big Shaq?" someone asked. "No way," came the reply. "But didn't he sound like him? He had the confidence, the swagger, the whole thing." It was funny to hear people still debating it, even after the truth had been revealed. A couple of people stopped me on my way out, laughing as they told me that I'd made their day. One woman, who had been in the back of the group, walked up to me and said, "Honestly, you kind of do have that Big Shaq energy. I'm not gonna lie, I was ready to follow you on Instagram right then and there." The warmth of the crowd's reaction was something I didn't expect. I had imagined that the moment I admitted I wasn't Big Shaq, they'd turn away in embarrassment or disappointment. But instead, they'd embrace the humor of the situation, and it felt like I had just shared a funny story with a bunch of strangers who understood that life wasn't always as serious as we made it out to be. Some of the crowd kept the joke alive, with a few of them jokingly calling me Shaq as I walked away. It felt odd, but at the same time, I appreciated the fact that everyone was still treating me like a part of the joke, not the punchline. One guy even asked, "Hey, if you're not Big Shaq, does that mean you're still gonna drop a sick verse for us?" I couldn't help but laugh and shake my head. "Nope. Sorry. I'll leave the rapping to the pros," I said, winking at him as I turned to leave. The whole experience had left me with mixed emotions. On one hand, it was amusing to see how quickly people had bought into the idea that I was a celebrity, even when it wasn't true. On the other hand, it made me think about how easily we sometimes place people on pedestals, seeing them as more than human, just because they're famous or well known. The reactions from the crowd, though, reminded me that we all have a sense of humor and are capable of laughing at ourselves. It also made me realize that fame or popularity didn't matter as much as how you made people feel. Sure, I wasn't the real Big Shaq, but in that moment, I could see how easy it was to create a connection with people through humor, vulnerability, and honesty. It was refreshing to see that people didn't just want to see the star version of me. They just wanted to share a laugh. And that, in itself, was enough. When I finally walked away from the crowd, I couldn't help but reflect on the whole thing with a smile. It wasn't just the mix-up that was funny. It was the fact that everyone had been so open and welcoming. I hadn't expected such a positive reaction. And it reminded me of how important it is to embrace the unexpected and take things in stride. In the end, I wasn't Big Shaq, but for a few moments, I had shared something genuine with people, and that was enough for me. As I walked away from the crowd, still laughing at the absurdity of the situation, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of satisfaction. The whole incident had been a chaotic, unexpected, and somewhat surreal experience. But beneath the surface of the confusion, there was a deeper lesson I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about the mistaken identity, nor was it just about how easily people could be tricked. It was about something far more profound, something that stayed with me long after the crowd had dispersed and the laughter had faded. In a world where fame and success often define people's worth, it's easy to get caught up in the idea that who you are is determined by what others perceive you to be. I had unintentionally become part of this larger-than-life persona, and it was fascinating to watch how people reacted to what they thought was a celebrity. At the same time, it made me realize how people are constantly searching for something or someone to look up to, someone to believe in, someone to be in awe of. And in that moment, I was that person. Not because I was truly Big Shaq, but because the people around me had decided that I was. But as the reactions and the jokes started to wear off, the realization hit me. None of that mattered. Whether or not they believed I was a celebrity, they had treated me like one. And in the end, that wasn't the point. The connection we had in that brief moment wasn't built on fame or status, but on humor, shared experience, and a little bit of chaos. The real takeaway from all of this wasn't that I had been mistaken for a rapper. It was the reminder that the best moments in life often come from the unexpected, the unscripted, and the unplanned. The experience also brought to light something I'd always known deep down. Our perceptions of others are often shaped by what we want to see rather than the reality of who they are. People had believed I was Big Shaq, and for a while, I had become that person in their minds. But once the veil was lifted, once the truth came out, everything shifted, and suddenly, I was just another guy, just another human in the crowd. Yet, despite that shift, there was still laughter, still camaraderie, and still a shared moment of joy. It made me think about how we often put people on pedestals, how we create these idealized versions of them in our heads, and how quickly the bubble can burst when we realize they're just like the rest of us. Imperfect, flawed, but still deserving of respect. It was also fascinating to see how humor could bridge the gap between strangers. The whole situation had started with confusion, but it ended with laughter. That moment of vulnerability, when I admitted I wasn't Big Shaq, didn't isolate me from the crowd. Instead, it brought us closer. The shared recognition that we had all been part of something ridiculous, something light-hearted, allowed us to connect in a way that felt genuine and real. In the end, it didn't matter who I was pretending to be. It was the fact that I had embraced the situation with a smile, that I had laughed along with them, that made the difference. Looking back on the incident, I realized that it wasn't just about the laughs or the reaction of the crowd. It was about how easy it was to get caught up in the expectations others place on you. We all have a tendency to assume we know who people are based on their outward appearance or their fame, and sometimes we miss out on the true essence of a person. The person I was in that moment, someone who was just having fun and going with the flow, was far more relatable than the celebrity persona people had imagined me to be. In a way, it felt liberating to let go of the idea that I had to live up to some larger-than-life image. There was also a humbling aspect to it. Even though I wasn't Big Shaq, I had the power to affect the way people saw me, even if only for a brief moment. And in that moment, I chose to lean into the humor of the situation, to embrace the role I was being cast in. There was a lesson in that too. Sometimes, life hands you unexpected situations, and it's up to you how you choose to handle them. You can either get flustered, embarrassed, or frustrated, or you can choose to laugh, to take it in stride, and to see the humor in life's little absurdities. The latter approach, as I had just witnessed, was far more rewarding. As the day wore on, I found myself thinking about how the entire experience had unfolded. The mistaken identity, the laughter, the strange but meaningful interactions with strangers. All of it was a reminder that our lives are often full of moments that are beyond our control. What matters most is how we respond to those moments, how we shape our own narrative, and how we connect with the people around us. The crowd had mistaken me for Big Shaq, but in the end, I had shown them a side of me that wasn't about fame or success. It was about being human. And that's what resonated the most with them. That's the thing about life. Sometimes we try so hard to fit into the roles we think we're supposed to play. We try to be what people expect us to be, to live up to some external ideal. But more often than not, it's the moments when we let go of those expectations and embrace the chaos of life that we find true connection. Whether you're a famous rapper or just a regular person, we all have something to offer. And sometimes, the most genuine moments come from the most unexpected places. By the time I left that day, I had a new appreciation for the people around me and for the fleeting, yet meaningful, moments that make life so unpredictable. No, I wasn't Big Shaq, but in that brief moment, I had been part of something that felt just as memorable, just as real, and for that, I was grateful. I walked away from the situation with a smile on my face and a newfound perspective on life. Sometimes it's not about trying to be someone else or fitting into a mold. It's about accepting who you are, embracing the chaos, and letting life surprise you. And that's a lesson I'll carry with me for a long time to come.